October 25th, 1415. The feast day of Saints Crispin and Crispinian. A date that would become immortalized in English history, spoken in hushed reverence in taverns and shouted with pride on battlefields for centuries to come. But on that cold, rain-soaked morning in northern France, it seemed like nothing more than the day the English army would be annihilated. King Henry V of England stood in the mud, looking across a narrow field at an army that outnumbered his forces by at least 5-1. His men were starving, sick with dysentery, exhausted from a march of over 250 miles. They had been chased across France by an enemy determined to destroy them. Many could barely stand. Some had discarded pieces of armor because they lacked the strength to carry them. They had no cavalry to speak of, no reserves, no escape route. The French army blocking their path to Calais and safety was everything the English were not. Fresh, well-fed, armored in the finest plate money could buy, and confident to the point of arrogance. The flower of French chivalry had assembled to crush this impudent English king who dared invade their homeland. It should have been a massacre. Instead, it became a legend. Henry V was 28 years old, a king who had spent his youth as a warrior prince fighting Welsh rebels in brutal mountain warfare. He was not the dissolute prince of Shakespeare's imagination, though he had certainly enjoyed the pleasures of court in his younger days. When he took the throne, he transformed, becoming obsessed with his claim to the French crown through his great-great-grandmother Isabella of France. In his mind, he was not invading France. He was reclaiming what was rightfully his. This was not ambition, this was justice. His court and his nobles were less certain, but Henry had a way of making men believe in impossible things. He assembled an army, approximately 9,000 strong at the outset, and landed in France in August 1415. His initial target was Harfleur, a port city that would secure his supply lines. The siege took longer than expected, much longer. Disease ravaged his army. Dysentery, the medieval soldier's constant companion, killed more men than any French sword. By the time Harfleur fell, Henry had lost nearly half his army to sickness, death, or the need to garrison the captured city. The prudent decision would have been to return to England, declare victory, and come back next spring with a fresh army. But Henry did not become king by making prudent decisions. He chose instead to march his depleted, sick army across France to Calais, the English-held port on the northern coast. It was only about 120 miles as the crow flies, but Henry's army was not a crow. They had to find crossings over rivers, avoid French forces, and forage for food in a countryside that had been picked clean by both armies. The French, meanwhile, were assembling. Every noble house in northern France sent its knights. This was an opportunity for glory, for ransom, for the chance to capture an English king. The French constable, Charles d'Albret, commanded an army that contemporary sources claimed numbered 60,000, though modern historians suggest a more realistic 20 to 30,000. Even at the lower estimate, the English were catastrophically outnumbered. The two armies finally met near the village of Agincourt, on a narrow field flanked by thick woods on both sides. The geography was crucial. The field was perhaps 900 to 1,200 yards wide at its narrowest, recently plowed, and turned into a quagmire by days of October rain. The French army, with all its heavy cavalry, its armored knights, its crossbowmen and men-at-arms, filled the field like a gleaming metal ocean. Their armor caught what little light penetrated the gray October sky. Their banners displayed the heraldry of the greatest families in France. This was not just an army. This was French nobility, incarnate, come to remind England of its proper place in the world. They were so confident of victory that they had already begun arguing about who would get the honor of capturing Henry himself. Some wanted to ransom him. Others suggested cutting off his fingers so he could never draw a bow again and parading him through Paris in humiliation. These discussions happened within earshot of English scouts. The message was clear. The battle was already over. Only the details remained. Henry's army, by contrast, looked like something that had crawled out of a grave. His approximately 6,000 remaining men were exhausted, hungry, sick. Many suffered from dysentery so severe they had cut holes in their breeches to avoid the time-consuming process of undressing when the urge struck. Some were shoeless, their boots having rotted off during the march. They had consumed the last of their rations days ago. But they had one advantage that the French seemed to have forgotten or dismissed. They were English archers. Approximately 5,000 of Henry's army were longbowmen, armed with weapons that had been the terror of European battlefields for decades. The English longbow was not just a weapon, it was a national institution. From childhood, English boys practiced with increasingly powerful bows. By law, every man was required to maintain proficiency. By the time an archer joined the army, he could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, with accuracy at 200 yards, and killing, power at closer range that could punch through armor. But arrows do little good against armored knights if those knights can close the distance. Everything depended on whether the French would give the archers time to work. On the morning of October 25th, both armies formed up and waited. This was standard medieval procedure. You didn't just charge immediately. You positioned your forces, said prayers, made sure everyone understood the plan. The French had numbers and armor. Their plan was straightforward. Mounted knights would charge the English position, break their line, and then the men-at-arms would advance to finish the work. The crossbowmen were positioned but not prominently, as this was to be a battle won by noble knights, not common soldiers. The English plan was simpler: survive. Henry positioned his men-at-arms in the center, probably only about 900 men in full armor, with archers on both flanks arranged in a wedge formation. Some archers had been ordered to cut stakes and sharpen them, creating a makeshift defensive barrier against cavalry. It was desperate, improvised, and their only chance. The armies stared at each other across the muddy field for hours. Neither wanted to attack first. The French had the numbers and could afford to wait. The English couldn't afford to wait, but attacking uphill into an army 5 times their size seemed suicidal. Finally, Henry made a decision. He ordered his entire army to advance. This was audacious to the point of madness. They marched forward within longbow range of the French position, roughly 300 yards, and stopped. The archers hammered their sharpened stakes into the mud, creating a field of wooden spikes angled toward the enemy. And then they began to shoot. The sky darkened with arrows, not a metaphor. Contemporary accounts from both sides described the sun being blotted out by the sheer volume of English arrows in flight. 5,000 archers, each loosing 10 arrows per minute, created a storm of 50,000 arrows every 60 seconds. The sound alone must have been terrifying, a continuous whistling shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The arrows fell on the French army like steel rain. Most couldn't penetrate the plate armor of the knights, but they didn't need to. They struck horses, wounded men in the face and neck where armor was thinnest, created chaos and pain, and critically, they provoked exactly the response Henry needed: a charge. The French vanguard, stung by arrows and enraged by the English audacity, mounted their horses and charged. Contemporary sources suggest between 1,000 and 2,000 mounted knights thundered across the muddy field toward the English line. It should have been devastating. A cavalry charge of armored knights was the medieval equivalent of a tank assault. But the field was narrow, flanked by woods that compressed the charge into a tighter and tighter space. The mud was deeper than anyone had anticipated, sucking at the horses' hooves, slowing them, exhausting them before they even reached the English line. And all the while, the arrows fell. Horses screamed and fell. Knights were thrown. The charge lost cohesion, momentum, everything that made cavalry deadly. Those who did reach the English line found themselves funneled into an increasingly narrow front, unable to maneuver, crashing into the forest of sharpened stakes. Horses impaled themselves. Knights fell into the mud and found themselves unable to rise under the weight of their armor. The archers, seeing the cavalry charge faltering, dropped their bows, drew swords and mallets, and waded into the chaos to finish off the fallen French nobles. But the French were not finished. The dismounted men-at-arms of the French vanguard, seeing the cavalry charge fail, began their own advance. This was the flower of French nobility, knights in the finest plate armor money could buy, advancing on foot because the mud made mounted combat impossible. There were thousands of them, far outnumbering the English men-at-arms. They marched through the muddy field, through the bodies of their own cavalry, through the continuing arrow storm that now targeted their advance. Arrows that couldn't penetrate plate armor could still strike joints, gorge its faces. Men fell, but the advance continued. When they finally crashed into the English line, the real battle began. This was no longer archery. This was brutal, close-quarters melee. Knights swinging swords, axes, warhammers. Men grappling in the mud, drowning each other in pools of blood-mixed water. The fighting was so dense that men couldn't properly swing their weapons. They used daggers, punched with gauntleted fists, wrestled. The press of bodies was so tight that men who fell could not get up and suffocated under the weight of those fighting above them. The English line bent, but did not break. Henry himself fought in the thick of it, his royal crown on his helmet, making him a target. French knights specifically sought him out, hoping to end the battle by killing or capturing the king. At one point, a blow from a French sword struck Henry's crown, cutting a piece of it away but not penetrating his helmet. Around the king, his household knights fought like demons, creating a space of death that no Frenchman could cross. The archers, having exhausted their arrows or abandoned their bows, fought with whatever they could find. They dragged French knights into the mud, stabbed them through visor slits, bashed them with mallets. Medieval plate armor was magnificent protection, but it had weaknesses. The joints, the visor, the neck. And men fighting for their lives learn quickly where those weaknesses are. The French advance, despite its numbers, could not break through. The narrow field worked against them. They couldn't bring their numerical superiority to bear because there was no room. Knights in the back ranks pressed forward, compressing those in front into an immobile mass. Men in the front ranks couldn't fight properly because they couldn't move their arms. It became a crushing, suffocating nightmare, where French knights killed each other through sheer pressure. And then the English began to take prisoners. This was standard practice in medieval warfare. Knights were worth more alive than dead. A captured French noble could be ransomed for a fortune. English men-at-arms began pulling French knights out of the melee, disarming them and dragging them to the rear. Within an hour of brutal fighting, the English had captured hundreds of French nobles. The French vanguard was destroyed or captured. The field was carpeted with bodies, many still alive but unable to rise from the mud. It should have been over. The French should have recognized the battle was lost and withdrawn. But there was still a second division of French men-at-arms, fresh and ready, positioned behind the vanguard. And beyond them, a third division of mounted knights. The English were exhausted, running low on arrows, surrounded by wounded and prisoners. If the French pressed the attack with their remaining forces, the English would be overwhelmed. Henry stood in the mud, covered in blood and filth, and waited to see if the French would charge again. But something remarkable happened. The French 2nd and 3rd divisions did not attack. The nobles who commanded them, seeing the slaughter of the vanguard, the field choked with their dead and dying comrades, made the calculation that glory was not worth death in that muddy hell. There was confusion in the French ranks. Some wanted to attack. Others argued for withdrawal. The lack of unified command, the death or capture of the Constable d'Albret in the first assault, meant no one could make a decisive order. While the French argued, Henry faced a different crisis. Word reached him that French forces were in his rear, attacking the baggage train. In the chaos and with exhausted men barely holding the line, the presence of potentially thousands of French soldiers behind him was unacceptable. More critically, he had hundreds of French prisoners. If the battle resumed, those prisoners could take up weapons and attack from within the English position. Henry made a decision that would stain his reputation forever. He ordered the prisoners killed. His own knights refused, arguing it violated the laws of chivalry and would forfeit valuable ransoms. So Henry ordered his archers to do it. They had no such scruples about ransom, and began methodically executing the French prisoners. Contemporary sources disagree on how many were killed before the order was rescinded. Some say hundreds. Others suggest the order was only partially carried out before Henry learned the baggage train attack was minor and called it off. The massacre of prisoners remains controversial. Some historians argue it was militarily necessary given the circumstances. Others call it a war crime that violated every code of chivalric conduct. What is certain is that it terrified the remaining French forces. Seeing their captured comrades slaughtered, the French 2nd and 3rd Divisions made the decision to withdraw. They left the field without engaging, abandoning their dead and wounded. The Battle of Agincourt was over. The English, who should have been annihilated, stood victorious on a field covered with French dead. The casualties were staggeringly one-sided. The French lost somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 men, including dozens of the highest nobles in France. 3 dukes died. At least 90 lords and knights of the highest rank were killed or captured. The English losses were estimated at fewer than 400, possibly as low as 100. The exact numbers are disputed, but the disparity is not. This was not a battle. It was a catastrophe for France. Henry stood on the field as darkness fell, looking at what his starving, diseased, outnumbered army had accomplished. They had done the impossible. They had broken the military power of France through a combination of superior weapons, favorable terrain, and French overconfidence. But Henry knew that battles don't win wars. He still had to reach Calais. His army was still starving and sick. The French still had armies in the field. Agincourt was a miracle, but wars aren't won by miracles alone. The army gathered what they could, including the abandoned French supplies, and resumed their march. They reached Calais without further incident. The French were too shocked, too demoralized to pursue. Henry's bedraggled force boarded ships and returned to England as conquering heroes. The Battle of Agincourt became instant legend, the impossible victory, the triumph of the common English archer over the noble French knight, the day when 6,000 defeated 30,000. The propaganda value was immeasurable. In England, the victory was celebrated as divine intervention. God himself had sided with Henry's just claim to France. The cult of Crispin and Crispinian, the saints whose feast day fell on the battle date, exploded in popularity. Churches across England added special prayers and services. The longbow became a symbol of English identity, prowess, and divine favor. Every archer who fought at Agincourt became a hero in his local community. For France, the disaster was hard to comprehend. How had the finest army they could assemble been destroyed by a force 1/5 its size? The recriminations began immediately. Nobles blamed each other for poor command decisions. The decision not to use crossbowmen effectively was criticized. The choice to fight in narrow, muddy terrain was questioned. Some blamed the weather, arguing that without the rain turning the field to mud, the cavalry charge would have succeeded. Others pointed to overconfidence, the certainty of victory that led to tactical carelessness. All were probably correct to some degree. Agincourt was a perfect storm of English advantages and French mistakes. But the battle's greatest impact was psychological. The English left Agincourt believing they were invincible, that their cause was blessed by God, that their longbowmen could defeat any force on earth. This confidence would fuel continued English campaigns in France for decades. The French left Agincourt traumatized, questioning their military tactics, their leadership, their very identity as warriors. The myth of invincible French knighthood had been destroyed in a muddy field in 3 hours. The nobility had failed. The common soldiers, the archers, the infantry had proven more valuable than 1,000 knights in plate armor. It was a lesson that would reshape European warfare. Henry V would return to France and conquer vast territories, eventually forcing France to recognize him as heir to the French throne through the Treaty of Troyes. He came tantalizingly close to uniting England and France under a single crown. But he died suddenly in Nidinon 1422, possibly from dysentery. the same disease that had weakened his army before Agincourt. His infant son inherited both the English and French crowns, setting up decades of conflict that would eventually see England lose everything Henry had won. But that was in the future. On October 25, 1415, all that mattered was the impossible had happened. A starving, diseased, exhausted English army had destroyed a French force that outnumbered them 5-1. The Longbowmen of England, common men, drawn from farms and villages, had brought down the flower of French nobility. The muddy field at Agincourt had become hallowed ground where courage, skill, and desperation had overcome impossible odds. Shakespeare would immortalize the battle decades later in Henry V, putting words in the king's mouth that may never have been spoken but captured the spirit of that day. The "we few, we happy few, we band of brothers" speech resonates because it speaks to something universal. The small force facing overwhelming odds. The knowledge that defeat seems certain but choosing to fight anyway. The bond between soldiers facing death together. Agincourt embodied all of this. The battle also marked a turning point in military history. It demonstrated that massed archery fire could dominate a battlefield, that heavy cavalry was vulnerable in poor terrain, that discipline and defensive positioning could defeat superior numbers. The age of the mounted knight, the armored noble, as the decisive factor in warfare, was beginning to end. Gunpowder weapons were still decades away from dominance, but Agincourt showed that commoners with the right weapons and training could defeat nobles in the finest armor. It was a preview of the military revolutions to come. The longbow itself would eventually be replaced by firearms, but for a century after Agincourt, the English longbowman was the most feared soldier in Europe. French military planning became obsessed with countering them. Armor designs changed to better deflect arrows. Tactics evolved to avoid the kind of narrow killing ground that had doomed the French at Agincourt. But no amount of adaptation could erase the trauma of that October day. The survivors carried the memory for the rest of their lives. English archers told stories in taverns about the day they killed French dukes. French knights who escaped or were ransomed lived with the shame of defeat and the survivors' guilt of watching their friends drown in mud. Henry himself would reference Agincourt for the rest of his short life, using it as proof that God favored his claim to France. The battle became a touchstone, a moment when history bent in an unexpected direction. Today, standing in the fields near Agincourt, you can walk the ground where it happened. The woods that flank the battlefield are still there. The field itself is quiet farmland, peaceful and ordinary. There's a small museum and memorial, but if you stand there on a gray October day when the rain has turned the ground to mud, you can almost feel it. The weight of history, the echo of that impossible day. You can imagine the thunder of hooves on soft ground, the whistle of arrows, the clash of steel, the screams of dying men and horses. You can picture Henry V, 28 years old, standing in mud watching an army 5 times his size preparing to destroy him, and deciding that today was a good day to make history. You can feel what those English archers felt as they drew their bows and sent death flying across the field. Not glory, not chivalry, but grim, desperate professional competence. They were craftsmen, and their craft was killing, and they were very, very good at it. Agincourt remains one of history's most improbable military victories. The numbers, the conditions, the circumstances all said it was impossible. 6,000 exhausted men do not defeat 30,000 fresh troops. Starving archers do not destroy the finest knights in Europe. Desperate kings marching their armies to what seems like certain death do not emerge victorious. But on October 25, 1415, all of those impossible things happened. Not because of divine intervention, though contemporary accounts insisted on it. Not because of magic or luck, but because terrain, weapons, training, and leadership combined in a perfect moment where the impossible became inevitable. Where 6,000 men stood in mud and decided they would not die easily. Where English longbowmen became legend. Where a field in France became sacred ground. Where history for once sided with the desperate rather than the powerful. where the feast day of two obscure saints became forever synonymous with impossible victory, where Agincourt became a single word that meant courage, skill, and the knowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, the few can defeat the many, where 6,000 taught 30,000 that numbers alone do not win wars, that on one cold October day in 1415, when everything said they should die, the English army looked at impossibility and decided to make it possible. And they did.